You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Oh, it's such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Visit Blinds.com now for up to 45% off site-wide and free professional installation. Rules and restrictions apply.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 515th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, with the last episode, we looked at 3 changes that took place in the Atlanta campaign, beginning in late May and early June 1864. The first was the building of strong and extensive fieldworks anywhere the army stopped.
The second was the change in the relationships Confederate Commander Joe Johnston had with 2 of his top lieutenants, John B. Hood and William Hardee. Johnston's relationship with Hood became more distant, even as Hood was angling for Johnston's job, and the 2 men became bitter enemies, while Johnston's relationship with Hardee warmed up and they became allies.
Then the third aspect of the campaign that impacted how it unfolded was the disagreement over the use of rebel cavalry to disrupt Sherman's railroad supply line. That disagreement was just the latest chapter in the story of the friction and dysfunction that characterized the relationship between Joe Johnston and Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
Meanwhile, with the Federals having abandoned their foray out into the Georgia countryside that resulted in the fighting along the Dallas, New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill line, and having returned to the railroad, the exhausted Union soldiers enjoyed a few days' rest in their camps south of Allatoona around Ackworth, while Yankee repair crews worked to rebuild the railroad bridge across the Etowah River.
They completed that task ahead of schedule on June 11th, and once again supplies flowed southward down the Western and Atlantic to Sherman's troops without interruption.
Meanwhile, on June 8th, Sherman had the pleasure of welcoming 9,000 men of the Army of the Tennessee's 2 long-absent divisions of Frank Blair's 17th Corps. Well, Sherman calculated, inaccurately, that those reinforcements made up for the casualties he'd lost in the campaign's first month. Actually, incomplete reports showed that George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland alone suffered almost 8,800 casualties in May.
To match the Yankees' move back to the line of the railroad, Joe Johnston had shifted the Confederate Army from the New Hope Church area along a path south of and parallel to the route taken by the Federals. When the rebels reached the railroad north of Marietta, they'd gone into position on a line that ran generally from east to west, a few miles south of Ackworth and less than 40 miles northwest of Atlanta.
Several isolated heights dominated the area north of Marietta and offered excellent vantage points above the roads leading southward from the Federal camps. The more prominent of these heights were Lost Mountain, west of Marietta and about 500 feet in height, Pine Mountain, northwest of Marietta, Brush Mountain, north of town, and Kennesaw Mountain.
Both Pine and Brush Mountains rose about 300 feet above the surrounding landscape. Kennesaw is a ridge some 2 miles long and broken into 3 segments.
Big Kennesaw, the northeastern end of the ridge, is about 800 feet in height. Little Kennesaw, in the center, is some 400 feet high, while Pigeon Hill, the southwestern end of the ridge, is about 200 feet in elevation.
Brush Mountain, Pine Mountain, and Lost Mountain form a slightly bent line running roughly from northeast to southwest, with Pine a bit in advance, that is, northwest of a line connecting the other 2 heights.
The Kennesaw Ridge is parallel to and 2 or 3 miles south of the right center of this line. On those elevated positions in early June 1864, the Confederates built signal stations and emplaced artillery batteries. They constructed long lines of formidable trenches on, around, and between the commanding heights. So once again, Joe Johnston had the rebel army solidly in place, and once again, he hoped that the Yankees would attack his fortified line head on.
Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman sat in his headquarters at Ackworth, contemplating his next move.
The Western and Atlantic Railroad stretched south from Ackworth, passing through Big Shanty, which today is Kennesaw, and then running almost due south toward Kennesaw Ridge. Just north of the ridge, the tracks made a sharp turn to the east and paralleled the ridge until they passed its northeastern end. There, the railroad turned south around Big Kennesaw to reach Marietta.
The railroad's route compelled Sherman to move directly south from Ackworth. If he shifted his force off to the east, he'd find more favorable terrain, but he'd leave both the railroad and his recently established supply depot at Allatoona vulnerable to a strike by the rebels.
For that reason, the Sandtown Road became, and would remain so for a month, the axis of the Federal advance. This crucial highway ran south from Ackworth to Gilgal Church between Pine and Lost Mountains. It continued south, passing along to the west of Kennesaw Ridge to reach Sandtown on the Chattahoochee River, about 9 miles downstream from the Western and Atlantic Railroad Bridge.
On its southward path, the Sandtown Road zigged and zagged, crossed numerous creeks, and intersected several routes leading east or northeast into Marietta.
As usual, Sherman expected Johnston would fall back and make his next stand along the Chattahoochee, although he thought the rebels might offer slight opposition at some points north of the river. On June 6th, Sherman told Schofield, "I think Johnston will oppose us lightly all the way to the Chattahoochee, and then defend that line with all his ability."
Sherman had told Schofield that he wanted to get the Federal armies moving once again on June 8th or 9th. However, as it turned out, the Yankees didn't leave their camps until the 10th.
By then, scouting by Union cavalry had revealed that the rebels were present in force to the front and holding a fortified line stretching from the railroad southwest as far as Lost Mountain.
Over the next several days, small-scale skirmishing erupted here and there along the line of contact between the opposing forces as the Yankees probed forward.
Sherman's attention soon focused on Pine Mountain, which stood a short distance in advance of the main Confederate line. William Bates' division of Hardee's Corps held Pine Mountain and had connected that forward outpost to the rest of the rebel works with a network of trenches. Pine Mountain thus became a salient, or projecting angle, in the Confederate line.
On the Federal side, by June 12th, George Thomas had the Army of the Cumberland deployed in front of the Pine Mountain salient, and Sherman realized he might break the enemy line by thrusting some of his force in between Pine and Kennesaw Mountains.
So on the 12th and 13th, Thomas worked the Army of the Cumberland around to the east of Pine Mountain, and it appeared that the Yankees might isolate Bates' division, cutting it off from the rest of the rebel army.
On the morning of June 14th, Johnston and Hardee went to Pine Mountain to study the salient and decide if they should withdraw Bates' troops from so endangered a spot. The Bishop General, Leonidas Polk, accompanied them to take advantage of the view from Pine Mountain and study his own lines to the east.
Foolishly disregarding warnings that Yankee artillery had the range of the mountaintop, the generals climbed onto the breastworks to get a clear field of view of the area below. A large group of Bates' soldiers soon gathered to gawk at the three high-ranking officers.
Sherman was also out on the lines that morning, and when he observed a crowd of rebels on the summit of Pine Mountain, he ordered some nearby Federal artillery to disperse the group with a few shots.
The Confederate generals had just begun to walk away from the summit when the first Union shell fell near them. Joe Johnston and William Hardee quickly scurried for cover, but Leonidas Polk, not wishing to set a bad example for the men, walked deliberately away from the exposed area. And as he did, an enemy cannonball hit him and passed through his body. Polk was the second highest-ranking Confederate general killed in the war, after Albert Sidney Johnston, who was mortally wounded and died at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862.
Polk's body was carried off the mountain and sent to Augusta, Georgia for burial. His body would be reinterred in New Orleans in 1945. In the Bishop General's pockets were found 4 copies of a religious tract, 3 of which Polk had inscribed for presentation to Johnston, Hardee, and Hood. All were soaked with his blood.
Major General William Wing Loring, the ranking officer in the Corps, took temporary command after Polk's death, and by Joe Johnston's order, Bate withdrew his division from Pine Mountain that night.
Hi, Leo Laporte here, and on Mac Break Weekly, I sit down with Alex Lindsay, Jason Snell, and Andy Anako every week to talk through everything happening in the Apple world. News, opinions, plenty of insider perspective. We keep it sharp, thoughtful, and fun. If you love Apple, you'll feel right at home. Subscribe and download at twit.tv/MBW.
On the Confederate side, Hood's Corps held the right of what would come to be called the First Kennesaw Line. Polk's Corps held the center and Hardee's the left. Then Jackson's cavalry division had to cover a lot of ground and was stretched all the way from Hardee's left to Lost Mountain.
The weak part of the Confederate position was the left, and on June 16th, some of Schofield's Federals, moving around to the south on the far right of Sherman's front, seized high ground from which their artillery could enfilade Hardee's line off to their east.
Schofield's success forced Hardee to reposition his corps. That night, he abandoned much of his line and pulled his left back to a ridge east of Mud Creek. This stream rose near Pine Mountain and flowed almost directly south, passing between Lost Mountain and the Kennesaw Ridge.
Hardee's withdrawal behind Mud Creek forced the rebels to abandon Lost Mountain. The Confederate Army's position, dubbed the Mud Creek Line, or the Second Kennesaw Line, now resembled the upper left corner of a doorway. Hardee's trenches ran north to south, while Loring's and Hood's troops held a line running west to east.
On the Federal side, on June 17th, George Thomas discovered that the angle in the new Confederate line permitted his artillery to enfilade Hardee's new position from the north.
Again, finding themselves in an untenable position, obviously the rebels couldn't remain in the Second Kennesaw Line, and so Joe Johnston put his engineers to work building another set of fortifications near Marietta. However, this Third Kennesaw Line wouldn't be ready until the 19th, so the Confederates had no choice but to stay put and grit their teeth and endure 2 days of fierce shelling.
Finally, though, the engineers completed the new line, and during the night of June 18th, 19th, the rebel army moved back to it.
Hardee's troops remained on the left, with Jackson's rebel cavalry to his left. In the center, Loring occupied the formidable Kennesaw Ridge itself, and Hood's men held the right of the line east of Big Kennesaw, with Wheeler's horsemen covering their right.
In this new line, Hardee's troops and Jackson's cavalry faced to the west. Loring's men faced to the northwest, and Hood's troops and Wheeler's horsemen faced more to the north.
When the Yankees found the enemy's Mud Creek defenses abandoned, Sherman again leaped to the conclusion that the rebels were withdrawing to the Chattahoochee. However, within a few hours, as the Federalists advanced, they discovered that once more the rebels had simply pulled back to another line nearby, this one much stronger and anchored on the Kennesaw Ridge itself. And since the angles in this new Confederate line were at the Kennesaw Ridge, the looming bulk of the mountain shielded both ends of the position against enfilading artillery fire. Except for Rocky Face Ridge at Dalton, this third Kennesaw line was the strongest position the rebels occupied during the campaign.
However, as was the case with the Dalton position, the Confederates couldn't hold the 3rd Kennesaw line if they simply sat passively in their trenches. To stay on Kennesaw Mountain, Joe Johnston would have to conduct an active defense, that is, watching for and taking advantage of opportunities to strike blows that would throw the Yankees off balance and derail their plans.
If Joe Johnston didn't conduct an active defense, though, it would be only a matter of time until Sherman once again maneuvered the Confederates out of their fortifications.
As it turned out, it rained almost every day from late May to late June. The rain turned roads into ribbons of mud, fields into lakes, and the area's many small streams into rivers.
Day after day of rain filled the trenches with water and soaked men, animals, wagons, and equipment. The rain also slowed the Federals' progress, and it took a day or so for them to work their way up to confront the rebels in their new line.
McPherson remained on the left of Sherman's force, facing the Confederates on Kennesaw Ridge and in the area north of Marietta.
George Thomas was to the right of McPherson, facing Hardee's trenches that extended south from the southwestern end of Kennesaw Mountain.
Slowly, the whole Yankee force oozed to the south across the rain-soaked Georgia countryside.
On June 20th, Hooker's corps on Thomas's right approached the Powder Springs Road, about 4 miles southwest of Marietta. Meanwhile, Schofield, who had been off in the Lost Mountain area, had moved along the Sandtown Road to Noses Creek. Late on June 21st, Schofield's lead elements made contact with Hooker's right flank a mile or so west of a place called Kolb's Farm on the Powder Springs Road.
Rebels atop Kennesaw Mountain had watched the southward extension of the Federal right. During the night of June 21st, 22nd, Johnston countered by shifting Hood's corps from the right of the Confederate line to the left.
On the morning of the 22nd, Hood's divisions slipped into position on Hardee's left, facing Hooker and Schofield and extending the Confederate line south across the Powder Springs Road. Jackson's rebel cavalry patrolled the area to Hood's left, while Wheeler's dismounted horsemen took over Hood's old trenches east of Kennesaw Mountain.
Early on June 22nd, Schofield and Hooker resumed their push eastward along the Powder Springs Road. That afternoon, some of Schofield's advanced troops captured several prisoners from the 58th and 60th North Carolina regiments of Hood's corps.
Realizing this meant Hood's corps had been shifted to the Confederate left, Schofield and Hooker concluded that Joe Johnston was going to strike the Federal right. As a result, they halted their advance and their men immediately went to work throwing up field works.
The Federal generals sent forward 2 regiments, the 123rd New York of Hooker's Corps and the 14th Kentucky of Schofield's command, to act as skirmishers to delay the anticipated rebel advance as long as possible.
Moving into an open field to their front, the Kentuckians and New Yorkers advanced slowly against stout resistance from rebel skirmishers. Then, as the Yankees pushed forward into a wooded area, they ran into large numbers of Confederates, formed into a long line of battle that extended out past their flanks. The 2 Union regiments quickly backpedaled until they reached the main Federal position.
And so, given plenty of warning, Schofield and Hooker were ready to meet the Confederate attack that followed hard on the heels of the retreating Union skirmishers. Now, Joe Johnston, of course, hadn't intended to launch an assault on the Federal right, but Hood seems to have taken the advance of the 2 Federal regiments as an attack on his new position. When those Yankees fell back, Hood decided to send 2 divisions of his corps forward in pursuit.
The Confederates advanced from east to west, some charging across an open field north of the Powder Springs Road, and others struggling over much rougher terrain to the south. Artillery along Hooker's portion of the Federal line to the north had a clear field of fire against Hood's right and sent a storm of shot and shell into the advancing Confederate ranks. Meanwhile, south of the road, the terrain itself helped break the force of the rebel attack.
It wasn't long before the rebels broke off their assault and fell back to their starting positions. Hood lost about 1,000 men that afternoon at Kolb's farm and gained nothing. Federal losses totaled about 300, mostly in the 2 regiments that first encountered the Confederates.
After the bloody, one-sided fight at Kolb's farm on June 22nd, Hood settled into his new position on the Confederate left. His trenches extended the rebel army's line southward to Ollie's Creek, and Jackson's rebel cavalry to his left held the south bank of the stream. After that, for several days, there was little movement along the lines of the armies, and the soldiers cleaned up as best they could, wrote letters home, strengthened their works, and waited for what would come next.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman, Johnston, and the Atlanta Campaign by Earl J. Hess.
Yes, another Hess book. Well, don't forget you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find information on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over at Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like Noah, Chris, Michael S., George B., and Matt S. have all done recently.
A big thank you to them, and also to David C., Gerard M., and James L. for their donations.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.